The studio went silent. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet. And everyone was shocked because Frank Sinatra looked at Johnny Carson and said, "I'm sorry." Something Sinatra had never said to anyone in his life. It was May 1984. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B in Burbank, California. The audience was buzzing with excitement because Frank Sinatra, chairman of the board, Old Blue Eyes, the voice of a generation, was scheduled to appear. Frank Sinatra didn't do talk shows often. When he did, it was an event. He was royalty. Untouchable. A legend who had sung for presidents, filled stadiums, lived a life that seemed larger than reality itself. Johnny Carson was in the middle of his opening monologue. A joke about politics. The audience laughed. Ed McMahon chuckled from his spot beside the desk. Everything was running smoothly. Another Tuesday night. Another show. And then Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage. The audience erupted. Standing ovation before he'd even reached the guest chair. Doc and the band played My Way, as Sinatra crossed the stage with that confident walk, the walk of a man who'd owned every room he'd ever entered for 50 years. Johnny stood to greet him. They shook hands. Frank settled into the burnt orange guest chair, crossing his legs, adjusting his impeccable suit. His fedora rested on his lap. "Frank, it's great to have you back," Johnny said, sitting back down behind his desk. "Always a pleasure, Johnny," Frank replied, his voice that familiar smooth instrument. They talked. About music. About Vegas. About Frank's upcoming tour dates. The conversation flowed easily. Two professionals who'd known each other for decades, comfortable in front of cameras, masters of their craft. But something was different tonight. Johnny could sense it. 30 years of reading people on camera had given him an instinct for when someone was holding something back. And Frank Sinatra, despite his casual demeanor, seemed to be carrying something heavy. 10 minutes into the interview, Johnny asked a standard question. "So Frank, you've been performing for, what, almost 50 years now. Any regrets? Anything you'd do differently?" It was supposed to be a softball. An easy setup for Frank to tell a charming story or make a joke. Instead, Frank went quiet. Carson stopped mid-smile. The entire studio froze. Frank looked down at his hands. At the fedora in his lap. His fingers traced the brim slowly, like he was working up courage. "Johnny," Frank said, his voice quieter than usual. "Can I tell you something? Something I've never said on television before?" Johnny's expression shifted from host to friend. "Of course, Frank. Anything." The audience leaned forward. Ed McMahon's jovial expression faded into concern. Doc Severinsen, standing with his trumpet ready for the next musical cue, lowered the instrument slowly. Frank took a breath. "There's something I need to say. And I need to say it here. Tonight. Because if I don't say it now, I never will. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1957. Johnny Carson wasn't always the king of late-night television. In 1957, he was a 31-year-old comedy writer and performer struggling to break into the big time. He'd been doing local television in Los Angeles, hosting game shows, writing jokes for other comedians, taking any gig that paid. He got a call one afternoon from a producer at NBC. They were putting together a variety show, a summer replacement program. They needed writers. The pay was minimal. The hours would be brutal. But it was network television. It was a chance. Johnny took the job. The show was called The Frank Sinatra Show. A variety hour featuring Sinatra performing with guest stars, comedy sketches, musical numbers. It was supposed to be Sinatra's triumphant return to weekly television. Johnny was one of 5 writers on staff. The youngest. The least experienced. The most eager to prove himself. Frank Sinatra was at the height of his powers in 1957. He'd just won an Oscar. His albums were selling millions. He was untouchable. And he knew it. The first writers' meeting was held in a rehearsal space in Burbank. Sinatra showed up 40 minutes late, didn't apologize, lit a cigarette, and sat down at the head of the table. "All right," he said, not bothering with introductions. "What have you got for me?" The head writer presented a sketch idea. Sinatra listened for 30 seconds, then waved his hand dismissively. "Next." Another writer pitched a musical number concept. Sinatra shook his head. "Boring." "Next." They went around the table. Every idea was rejected. Every pitch was dismissed. Sinatra didn't offer alternatives. Didn't provide notes. Just killed ideas with single words. "No." "Pass." "Terrible." Finally, it was Johnny's turn. He was nervous. This was Frank Sinatra, after all, but he'd prepared carefully. He had a sketch idea, a comedy bit where Sinatra would play a nightclub singer whose accompanist keeps playing the wrong songs. Johnny pitched it. Described the beats. Explained the jokes. Sinatra stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. "That's the stupidest thing I've heard all day," Sinatra said. "Who hired you? You're a kid. You don't know anything about comedy, about music, about anything. This sketch is garbage. You're wasting my time." The room went silent. The other writers looked down at their notepads. Nobody defended Johnny. Nobody said a word. Johnny felt his face burning. "I just thought." "I don't care what you thought." Sinatra cut him off. "I care about funny." "That ain't funny." "Do better or don't come back tomorrow." Sinatra walked out of the meeting. Johnny sat there, humiliated, while the other writers avoided eye contact. He'd just been dressed down by Frank Sinatra in front of his peers. His first big network job, and he'd already been told he was worthless. He didn't quit. He couldn't afford to quit. He came back the next day and the day after that. He wrote sketches that Sinatra ignored. He pitched jokes that never made it to camera. He endured 12 weeks of being treated like he was invisible. The show was cancelled after one season. Low ratings. Sinatra moved on to other projects without a backward glance. The writers scattered to other jobs. Johnny Carson took a gig hosting a game show called Who Do You Trust? It led to other opportunities. And eventually, in 1962, to The Tonight Show. He never forgot that summer. Never forgot being called stupid in front of a room full of people. Never forgot Frank Sinatra making him feel worthless. But he never talked about it publicly. Never mentioned it in interviews. Never used it as an anecdote. He just kept working. Kept climbing. Kept becoming the Johnny Carson that America came to love. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 27 years later, in 1984, Frank Sinatra sat in the guest chair on The Tonight Show and looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that no one in the studio had ever seen on his face before. Vulnerability. "Johnny," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a bastard to you in 1957. I treated you like you were nobody. I humiliated you in front of the writing staff. And I've carried that with me for 27 years. Johnny's face went pale. His hands, which had been holding cue cards, went slack. The cards fell from his fingers and scattered across his desk, some tumbling to the floor. The control room erupted into chaos. Director Bobby Quinn was frozen, staring at the monitors. Producer Fred DeCordova grabbed Bobby's shoulder. "Keep rolling," Fred whispered. "Don't you dare cut away." Ed McMahon's hand flew to his mouth. He'd been Johnny's friend for decades. He knew about that summer in 1957. Johnny had told him once, years ago, late at night over drinks. Ed had never expected to hear it mentioned again, let alone on live television. Frank continued, his legendary composure completely gone. "I was at the top then. I thought I was invincible. I thought I could treat people however I wanted because I was Frank Sinatra. And you were just some kid trying to make it. You didn't deserve what I said to you. Nobody deserves that." Johnny couldn't speak. He just stared at Frank, this man he'd known for decades, this legend who had wounded him so deeply when he was young and struggling. "I've watched you for 22 years, Frank said, gesturing around the studio. "I've watched you become the best at what you do. I've watched you treat people with respect, your guests, your staff, your audience. I've watched you be everything I wasn't. And every time I've been on this show, every time I've sat in this chair, I've wanted to say something. But I didn't know how. I didn't know if you even remembered. Or if you'd forgiven me." The audience was completely silent. 300 people holding their breath. Doc Severinsen stood with his trumpet at his side, tears visible on his cheeks. The band members had stopped pretending to be ready for their next cue. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood up. Not the casual standing he did sometimes during interviews. This was deliberate. He stepped out from behind his desk, that iconic desk that had been his shield for 2 decades, and walked around to where Frank sat. Frank looked up at him, uncertain. The chairman of the board, the man who'd sung "My Way" with such defiance, looked genuinely afraid of what Johnny might say. Johnny held out his hand. Frank stared at it for a moment. Then he stood up, the fedora falling from his lap to the floor, forgotten. They shook hands. But Johnny didn't let go. He pulled Frank into an embrace. The studio erupted. Not the wild applause of entertainment. The deep, cathartic applause of people witnessing something real. Something that transcended television. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. Johnny picked up Frank's fedora from the floor. He looked at it for a moment, then handed it back to Sinatra. "Frank," Johnny said, his voice steady despite the emotion. "I did remember. And I'll be honest, it hurt for a long time. But you know what I learned from that summer?" "What?" "I learned that being talented doesn't give you the right to be cruel. And I promised myself that if I ever got the chance to sit in this chair, behind this desk, I would never make anyone feel the way you made me feel that day." Frank nodded, clutching his fedora. "You kept that promise, Johnny. That's why you're who you are. And that's why I needed to say this. I needed you to know that I see it. I see what you became despite me, not because of me. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming." Johnny walked back to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer, the drawer where he kept personal things, the drawer producers weren't allowed to access. He pulled out a piece of paper. Old, yellowed with age. Folded carefully. "Frank," Johnny said, holding it up, "do you know what this is?" Frank shook his head. "This is the sketch I pitched to you in 1957. The one you called the stupidest thing you'd heard all day. I kept it. For 27 years, I've kept it in this desk." The audience gasped. Ed McMahon leaned forward, seeing the paper for the first time. "Why?" Frank asked, his voice breaking. "Because I needed to remember. I needed to remember that moment when I felt like quitting. When I thought maybe you were right, maybe I wasn't good enough. I kept this sketch to remind myself that the cruelest thing someone ever said to me didn't define me. That I could be better than that moment." Johnny carefully unfolded the paper. "You want to know something funny? I actually used this sketch. 7 years later. On this show. With Dean Martin. It killed. The audience loved it. Dean loved it. It was one of the best segments we ever did." He looked at Frank. "The sketch wasn't stupid, Frank. Your judgment that day was wrong. But you taught me something valuable anyway. You taught me that I didn't need your approval to be good at this. I just needed to keep working." Frank Sinatra did something no one had ever seen him do on television. He walked over to Johnny's desk, reached out, and took the yellowed paper from Johnny's hands. "May I keep this?" Frank asked quietly. Johnny nodded. Frank folded the paper carefully and placed it in his inside jacket pocket. Over his heart. "I'm sorry, Johnny," Frank said. And this time, he didn't just say it. He meant it with every fiber of his being. "I know," Johnny replied. "And Frank, thank you. For saying it. For meaning it. The audience rose as one. Standing ovation. Doc and the band played softly, not My Way, but something gentler. Ed McMahon wiped tears from his eyes openly. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After that night, the sketch lived in Frank Sinatra's jacket pocket until the day he died. His daughter found it there and returned it to Johnny with a note. He carried your words with him. Thank you for forgiving him. Johnny had it framed. It hangs in the Smithsonian now, next to a photograph of two legends shaking hands. A reminder that it's never too late to apologize, and never too late to forgive.